A man who thinks too much does less than he's capable of and suffers more than he needs to. Inspired by Schopenhauer, you think your thoughts are protecting you. You believe that by analyzing, calculating, preparing, you're gaining control. But Schopenhauer would say, your thoughts are not always your allies, especially when they spiral, especially when they trap you in what-ifs, in doubts, in imagined outcomes that never arrive. Overthinking is the silent enemy of confidence. It paralyzes your action, poisons your clarity, and slowly convinces you that doing nothing is safer than being wrong. In this video, we unpack Schopenhauer's raw, unfiltered observation on how overthinking destroys men's confidence. You'll discover how the mind, when left unchecked, becomes a weapon you turn against yourself. You'll learn why certainty is a trap, how analysis becomes self-sabotage, and why the strongest men are often the ones who choose decisiveness over perfection. Subscribe if you're ready to escape the mental loops that keep you stuck. Like and comment if your thoughts have ever talked you out of a life you were ready to live. Schopenhauer warned us, the mind, when left unchecked, becomes not a tool of clarity but a source of suffering. And nowhere is that more evident than in the man who overthinks. You know the type, not because you've met him, but because you've been him. You wanted to act, to speak, to move, but your mind started running its calculations. What if she doesn't respond? What if I fail? What if I look weak? And so you froze, you waited. You told yourself you needed more time, but time never helped. Because overthinking doesn't lead to readiness, it leads to paralysis. What you thought was intelligence was actually fear in disguise. The fear of being wrong, the fear of being exposed, the fear of loss. So your thoughts wrapped themselves around every possibility like armor, but that armor became a cage. Schopenhauer would say, your will wanted action, but your intellect created excuses. You weren't being cautious, you were being controlled by your need for certainty. And in that quest for certainty, you lost the moment. You lost momentum. You lost yourself. Overthinking doesn't just delay your decisions, it erodes your self-trust. Every time you hesitate, you reinforce the belief that you're not ready, that you don't know enough, that the risk is too high. And that voice, repeated often enough, becomes your identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who moves and start seeing yourself as someone who waits. But waiting doesn't build confidence. Action does. And every time you choose thought over motion, you're practicing fear, not preparation. But here's the cruel part. Overthinking feels like safety. It feels responsible, mature, even enlightened, because you're being careful. But Schopenhauer would call it illusion. A man who truly sees the world clearly knows when to pause and when to strike. He doesn't get lost in contingency plans. He chooses, then adjusts. He acts, then learns. And even when he fails, he moves with clarity. Because clarity isn't found in endless thinking. It's found in the doing, in the feedback, in the lived experience of what is real, not what is imagined. Most overthinking is rooted in one emotional pattern, the fear of making the wrong move. But wrong moves are part of mastery. You don't become decisive by never messing up. You become decisive by messing up and continuing anyway. You don't become wise by avoiding mistakes. You become wise by owning them. Schopenhauer knew, suffering refines the man who moves. It drowns the man who hesitates. And overthinking is hesitation in its most seductive form. So the next time your mind starts spinning, pause, not to think more, but to break the loop. To ask, is this thought leading me somewhere, or is it holding me hostage? The man who asks that question doesn't lose his intellect, he reclaims his agency. He doesn't kill thought, he puts it in service of motion. Because motion builds momentum, and momentum builds confidence. Not the false kind rooted in fantasy, but the real kind, rooted in experience, rooted in action. Schopenhauer believed that thought is meant to serve the will, not sabotage it. But in the mind of the modern man, this balance is reversed. You no longer think to act, you think to avoid acting. And slowly thought stops being a means to clarity and becomes a breeding ground for hesitation, fear, and self-doubt. Every Thought loop becomes another layer of resistance. You overanalyze the message you want to send. You rehearse the words you might say. You imagine every outcome except the one that matters most. You moving forward anyway. You start calling your hesitation standards. You say you're just being patient. But beneath the surface, you're not patient. You're scared. Scared of saying the wrong thing, scared of being rejected, scared of looking foolish. And so your mind crafts stories to justify your inaction, stories that sound intelligent, stories that feel responsible. But Schopenhauer would say, you're not being wise, you're being ruled, not by logic, but by the refusal to risk being uncomfortable. And the longer you stay in your head, the more distant life becomes. The opportunity passes. The woman you wanted walks away. The moment closes. And you're left with a mind full of brilliant thoughts and a life empty of movement. You start doubting your instincts, doubting your timing, doubting your worth, not because you failed, but because you never gave yourself the chance to even try. And that kind of doubt is the worst kind, because it doesn't come from reality. It comes from potential never tested. The tragedy of overthinking is not just lost time, it's the erosion of self-trust. You stop believing in your capacity to act. You assume every next step must be calculated, rehearsed, approved. You start needing perfect conditions, perfect words, perfect timing, and perfection becomes your excuse for inaction. But Schopenhauer reminds us, perfection is an illusion, and the man who waits for it will die waiting. Because nothing will ever be enough for a mind trained to fear consequence more than it desires clarity. But here's the truth. Your mind is not your enemy. It's your tool. The problem is that you've stopped using it to support your action. You've started using it to replace action altogether, and thought, without motion, becomes a trap. It becomes an echo chamber, a loop of questions with no answers. Because the only answer is in the doing. The clarity you seek will never be found in another thought. It will be found in stepping forward, feeling the resistance and moving anyway. So ask yourself honestly, what have you overthought so long that it no longer inspires action? It now feeds avoidance. And what would happen if, just for once, you ignored the voice telling you to wait? If you moved first and thought later? Schopenhauer would argue, the man who breaks that loop doesn't lose control, he reclaims it. Because once you prove to yourself that you can act before you feel fully ready, your mind no longer owns you. You own it. You tell yourself you're smart because you're cautious, that you're wise because you consider all the angles. But deep down, Schopenhauer would say, overthinking is rarely a sign of intelligence. It's a symptom of self-distrust. You don't overanalyze because you know too much. You do it because you don't trust what you already know. Your intuition speaks, but you drown it in what-ifs. Your desire stirs, but you bury it under doubts. Your body is ready, but your mind is busy questioning if it should be. This internal fracture makes you weak, not in ability but in presence. You're there, but not fully. Your eyes look at her, but your mind is elsewhere, crafting the next thing to say, revisiting. Something you already said, worrying how it will be received. And women feel it. People feel it. That mental dislocation, that subtle tension, that invisible withdrawal from the present moment. You're not leading the moment. You're trying to survive it. And nothing kills confidence faster than a man who's not fully where he is. Overthinking is not awareness, it's interference. It hijacks your clarity. It complicates simple truths. You know she's interested, but you question it. You feel pulled to say something, but you rehearse it until it dies. You sense a boundary has been crossed, but you analyze it into permission. In the end, you don't gain wisdom, you lose authority, because your mind has stopped serving your will and has started serving your fear. And Schopenhauer believed that once the will is dethroned, man ceases to live freely. The most grounded men aren't free of thought. They're free from its tyranny. They can listen to a fear but not obey it. They can consider consequences but not collapse under them. They know when to think and when to move. And that balance is what makes them powerful, because their presence isn't diluted by doubts. Their speech isn't delayed by perfectionism. Their action isn't sabotaged by contingency planning. They don't need every question answered. They trust themselves to figure it out as they go. But here's what most overthinkers never realize. No one is ever fully ready. Not her, not you, not anyone. You will never have all the information. You will never have all the guarantees. You will never eliminate risk. And once you accept that, thinking becomes lighter. Action becomes easier. Confidence grows, not because you know more, but because you trust more. And trust, Schopenhauer would say, is what separates the man frozen by thought, and the man who lets thought follow his lead. So let this be the shift. Stop calling your hesitation insight. Stop calling your doubt strategy. Start seeing your overthinking for what it really is, a fear of showing up imperfectly. And then show up anyway. Because every time you do, you build the kind of trust that thinking alone could never give you. The trust that says, I'll move first. I'll figure it out later, and I'll be okay either way. There's something tragic about overthinking that few men talk about. It doesn't just delay action, it erases your presence. The more you hesitate, the more you disappear. Opportunities fade, attention shifts. The moment you were meant to own passes, and suddenly you're no longer seen as someone decisive or grounded. You're seen as uncertain, indecisive, weak. Not because you are, but because you trained the world to see you that way by staying silent, by stalling, by standing still. And Schopenhauer would say, the man ruled by his mind forgets how to be in the world. He becomes a spectator of his own life. Think about how many moments you missed, not because you lacked ability, but because you doubted yourself into silence. The woman who gave you an opening, you questioned it. The conversation that needed your truth, you filtered it. The decision that could have changed everything, you hesitated. And now you're left not just with regret, but with a growing sense that life is slipping through your fingers while your mind tries to figure it all out. But life isn't figured out, it's lived. And overthinkers don't live. They forecast. They over-prepare. They miss. This kind of delay teaches others how to respond to you. People stop waiting for your leadership. Women stop feeling your energy. The world begins to pass over you, not because it's cruel, but because you trained it to. And now you're not just behind, you're forgotten. Not because you lack value, but because you buried your value under layers of what-ifs. And the saddest part? You think you're being responsible, but you're not being responsible, you're being invisible. True masculinity isn't loud. It's not reckless, it's not impulsive, but it is active, it moves, it speaks, it shows up even when uncertain. Because presence is not about perfection, it's about availability. And Schopenhauer would argue, the man who never risks rejection, never risks being wrong, never risks failure, also never risks being seen. And if you're not seen, you can't connect, you can't lead, you can't impact. You simply exist, quietly, cautiously, tragically. Overthinking is the thief of visibility. You disappear from rooms because you're trapped in your head. You lose opportunities not because they were impossible, but because you weren't present enough to receive them. And that invisibility doesn't just hurt, it builds resentment. You begin to hate the world for not choosing you. But the truth is, you didn't choose yourself, not fully. You showed up physically, but not energetically. You were alive, but you weren't there. So let this be the call back to presence, to movement, to risk. Not reckless risk, but real action. The kind that trusts that your truth, your voice, your instincts are enough, that your timing, while imperfect, is better than paralysis, that your failure, while possible, is better than being forgotten. Because the man who moves, who speaks, who dares, isn't always right, but he's always seen. And sometimes that's all you need to change everything. Most men believe that if they could just think a little more, prepare a little better, plan a little longer, they'd feel ready. But Schopenhauer would say, clarity does not come before the leap. It comes after. You don't become certain and then move. You move and then clarity finds you. The man who waits for perfect certainty will live his entire life in the shadow of it. Because certainty is not the reward of more thought, it's the reward of courage. When you act, you get feedback. When you hesitate, you get noise. One path brings truth. The other brings confusion, because your mind is not designed to resolve things it hasn't experienced. And the more you try to think your way into action, the more disoriented you become. You start asking questions you can't answer. You imagine outcomes you can't control. You make assumptions based on fear, not fact. And slowly, your thinking turns toxic. Not because thought is bad, but because thought without motion becomes madness. But the man who moves, who speaks, who risks, who chooses, he begins to discover something powerful. He didn't need more thought. He needed more exposure. Exposure to the tension, exposure to the unknown, exposure to the moment he was avoiding. And in that exposure, his thinking sharpens, his confidence stabilizes, his energy expands. Because now, his mind isn't guessing, it's learning. Not through fantasy, but through friction. Overthinking will tell you that readiness is a requirement, but it's not. Readiness is a lie the mind tells to keep you safe. And safe, for the man who wants to grow, is another word for stuck. The man who grows the fastest is the one who moves before he's fully ready, who accepts imperfection, who embraces awkwardness, who stops trying to get it right and starts living in what is real. Schopenhauer would say, it is better to stumble in truth than to remain still in illusion. So what would happen if you gave yourself permission to be wrong and acted anyway? What would change if you trusted your instinct more than your inner critic? What would open if you let the moment lead instead of letting fear delay it? The man who answers these questions with movement, not more mental rehearsal, is the man who begins to build the kind of confidence that can't be shaken. Because it wasn't built in his head, it was built in reality. And that's what makes you magnetic. Not your perfection, not your polish, but your presence, your decisiveness, your willingness to engage with life, even when uncertain. That's what women feel. That's what people respect. That's what makes you remembered, not because you had the perfect answer, but because you had the courage to speak while still searching for it. And that, Schopenhauer would argue, is the man who is free. Not from thought, but from the fear of needing it to be complete before he begins. You thought you needed more time, more thought, more preparation. You thought, if you could just think it through one more time, you'd feel ready. But Schopenhauer would say, you've mistaken caution for clarity and thinking for truth. What you were really doing wasn't thinking, it was avoiding. Avoiding the tension of action, avoiding the risk of imperfection, avoiding the truth that no matter how long you wait, life won't wait for you. Overthinking didn't protect you, it paralyzed you. It taught you to question what you already knew, to distrust your instinct, to rehearse instead of speak, to delay instead of decide. And the worst part, you became good at it, so good that now you call it wisdom. Now you call it being intentional. But deep down you know the truth. You're not being intentional. You're being invisible. You're not being strategic. You're being scared. And it's costing you everything. Connection, momentum, presence. Because the man who thinks too long about everything ends up acting on nothing. He lives inside possibilities while life passes by outside. He watches others move, speak, connect, fail, grow, while he stays behind with perfect plans and no progress. Schopenhauer would tell you the only way out is not through another thought. It's through motion. It's through that uncomfortable, uncertain, irreversible decision to move before you feel ready and to trust that clarity will meet you there. So what do you do now? You stop treating your thoughts like commands. You stop obeying every fear dressed as logic. You stop making the perfect moment a condition for showing up. And you start moving, not recklessly, but courageously. You say what needs to be said. You do what needs to be done. You lead with the truth you already carry, not the fantasy of having it all figured out. And that's when something shifts. That's when your life begins to reflect your will, not just your worries. You'll still think, of course you will. But now your thoughts serve your direction. They sharpen your path. They don't paralyze it. You'll still feel fear, but now it won't freeze you. It will remind you that something important is on the line. You'll still make mistakes, but now they'll teach you faster than any theory ever could, because you're finally living. And living requires motion, friction, contact, risk. So next time the loop begins, next time your mind starts spinning out stories, doubts, delays, ask yourself one question. Am I thinking to gain clarity, Or am I thinking to avoid action? If it's the second one, stop and move, say it, do it, begin. Because confidence isn't built by thinking more. It's built by proving to yourself again and again that you will no longer wait to be perfect before giving yourself permission to be powerful. Subscribe if you're done thinking yourself into circles and ready to walk forward even when uncertain. Like and comment if you've ever watched life pass you by while your mind tried to make it safer. Because the man who stops overthinking doesn't just make decisions, he makes impact.